Yes, it's time for The World This Week, 7 days, 4 Paris-based correspondents, 1 hour. The World This Week, where we welcome Christopher Dickey of Newsweek and
The Daily Beast.
Also with us, Vivian Walt of Time Magazine and Elisabeth Moutet of the Sunday and Daily Telegraph and Stefan Siemens of Der Spiegel and...
Well, Spiegel online, the internet.
That's right. Both service. In English and in German.
Yep.
The World This Week, where throughout the week you can join the conversation on Facebook and on Twitter, where you can find us at François F24. Now, it's the home stretch of the presidential election campaign in France. 3 weeks to go to the first round, but the French seem otherwise preoccupied, it seems. 19 arrests in various places in the early hours of Friday as the government announces it's broken up a jihadist network, this unrelated to the authorities' hunt for possible accomplices of the so-called Toulouse shooter, who, after targeting French soldiers and a Jewish primary school, died in a hail of bullets after a 32-hour siege last week. So what's the impact on the campaign? Well, voters tell surveys that their top concern remains, by far and away, jobs and the economy. That's what they say. But what about the candidates? Nicolas Sarkozy, in one poll published on Thursday, catching up fast with 3 weeks to go to the first round. He's ahead now in the first round by 4 percentage points. Now running even in other polls with the socialist candidate. And the far right's Marine Le Pen moving back up to third place. As for the second round, he's narrowing the gap. It's still François Hollande in the lead, but that gap down to 6 points. Remember, it had been 20 points. And Elisabeth Moutet, are we seeing the mother of all comebacks?
Yes. We definitely are. It takes time for the polls to actually give the slow evolution of people's minds, because when you've thought something, you don't switch on a dime. It takes a little bit of time. But I think he has played to his strengths, and that in the Toulouse affair, he couldn't do otherwise, but he played it very well, and Hollande has played to his weaknesses. And he wasn't helped by the fact that Hollande was on the sidelines, and then his deputies started arguing too early. And they, like Marine Le Pen, suffered from having criticized the police too soon or having said that the regime wasn't doing enough. Because I think what the French were really after was dignity. And that's what they had against Sarkozy at the beginning of his first mandate. And that's what they had against anybody who was not in the national consensus. And so I think Sarkozy overall has acted presidential in this one, and it's helped him tremendously.
Vivian Walt?
Well, I think more than the security issue, this incident allowed him to show a side of himself which we haven't seen for quite a long time, and that's just simply heart. If you think back to so many moments during the whole Toulouse crisis, the funeral of the soldier and so on, where he came out with passion. And, that's what's been lacking. What's been lacking is the human being. And it's what people have always said about Sarkozy. And suddenly the human being was back. And I think that certainly has helped him quite a lot.
Nicolas Sarkozy on the campaign trail this week, baiting his socialist rival, saying, well, we're not supposed to talk about security. The audience laughing. And on Friday, warning his fellow citizens not to underestimate the impact of Toulouse on France.
What must be understood is that the trauma of the Toulouse and Montauban shootings profoundly affected our country, a little bit like the 9/11 attacks of 2001 in New York. I'm not comparing the magnitude, but you can't help but draw the comparisons.
Christopher Dickey, you've written books on 9/11. Would you draw the comparison?
No. I mean, this is an attack very much like attacks that have taken place in France before, back in 95 with Khalid Kelkal, even back in the 80s. Actually, France has a long record, not a lot recently, but a long record of terrorist attacks of relatively low magnitude. And this is of relatively low magnitude, whatever the emotional tenor that has been struck in the last few days. It was a horrific act, but it's not 9/11, where 3,000 people die and the largest buildings in the city come down. It just isn't even remotely similar.
I think what Sarkozy has done is he's taken all the mileage out of that event, and when he's saying now in the radio interview that this is a kind of a event that will mark France for years to come, I think he rather wants to instill his role as being in this regalian position of the presidency. We must not forget that when at the very beginning of the campaign, when it was much focused on social issues, he was seen as the divider, And now with Toulouse, all of a sudden, he's back in his presidential outfit, and that works to his best. And when you look at what his headquarters says is, this is what we're going to pull through for the next 3 weeks to come.
I think it's pretty hard to milk something like this for three weeks in the current environment.
I think today's the fact that the Islamists were taken in this morning, I think it's not a coincidence. Figaro has it on page 1. I think it just wants to show this is an ongoing process, and here you need a strong president, the only one who can protect.
But of course, that's what he wants to show.
It also raises questions about the holes in his intelligence service, and how did this young man come to acquire these weapons? Why is it only today that they've arrested? They've supposedly cracked this jihadi cell. That also has weapons.
Everybody has weapons in those areas, in those circles. It's extremely easy to buy a Kalashnikov. It's extremely easy to get an Uzi. When they have even sort of low-level riots in the banlieues, they find these things. It's not as if it was unheard of.
I think that one of the things that Sarkozy has to fight is an image of real cynicism, and I think this can play as a cynical maneuver. This roundup and these arrests. I mean, it sounds like the prefect in Casablanca saying, round up the usual suspects.
I think you're being cynical on this. I think it's all very well to say, we see the effect, we can see that it's going to favor the campaign, but you yourself said that the French have got 20 years ahead of experience in terms of investigating Islamic terrorism. We had, in the late 70s, we had Iranian terrorism, we had Algerian terrorism in the 90s, we had Palestinian terrorism. Unfortunately, French investigative magistrates and the police have a great deal of experience about those questions. They were watching those networks.
Not enough to stop the shooter in Toulouse.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. The shooter in many ways was below the radar because he was almost
in every way, it seems.
But his brother wasn't.
He was an individual who happened to have been to Pakistan and Afghanistan twice in 2 years, and whose brother was being watched carefully by the police, and I'm not sure exactly what the brother's relationship with the police may have been. So,
well, Israeli intelligence raised a point about that since he'd been in Israel, they said, well, he can only have gotten into the country because he must have been. They must have gotten a hint from French security services. Sounds like a long shot.
Well, if you don't need a visa if you're French to go to Israel.
If you're a French citizen,
not with that name. I've seen Americans at the Jordan-Israeli border standing. They had the wrong names, and they stood there for 3 hours before they got in.
When France 24, by the way, went to the housing project where Mohamed Merah, the Toulouse shooter, grew up, our video journalist, Karim Hakiki, failed to find anyone preparing for jihad. What he did find, though, was a world unto itself, drug dealers who keep an eye on who's entering their patch, who's leaving. And it's interesting because, Vivian Walt, one issue that's still not an issue on this campaign is the plight of France's working-class suburbs, where in the past there's been full-blown riots.
Well, it seems to me that one thing that Sarkozy could claim, actually, is that there have not been riots in the last few years. Despite the terrible recession, you would have thought that it would have been kind of a perfect moment for riots to erupt in the banlieue, and they haven't. So clearly something has gone right for Sarkozy. But in some ways, this issue is never quite an election issue because you're not dealing with independent voters, swing voters who might go either way. It's not like the population of the banlieue are going to go vote for Sarkozy anyway. It's not like he can win them over to his
it depends who in the banlieue. I totally disagree on this. When you've got lots of people who live just next to where the police can't get in, the firemen get thrown out and get rocks thrown at them. If you look at the vote in the 93, for instance, in the Seine-Saint-Denis, you will find that there are entire communities who are voting completely to the right, not to mention Le Pen.
And again, a sample of the front pages this Friday. Stéphane Simons was mentioning conservative daily Le Figaro. Top story there is about 4 fundamentalists, imams, barred from France. There you see it in big letters there. The left-wing tabloid Libération asks, where's the economic crisis gone in this campaign? The foreign press seems to think the French candidates are well out to lunch. Literally, if you read The Economist, they're doing a spoof there of the famous Impressionist painting by Edouard Manet, where you see Hollande and Sarkozy enjoying a picnic and dodging the real issues. In its lead editorial, France in denial. The magazine writes, what is most striking about the French election is how little anybody is saying about the country's dire economic straits.
It's why, I find this very amusing that we journalists say, wait a second, we had decided what you ought to find important. What does it mean that you're not following our script? Tough.
Well, The Economist does that all the time.
That is very true.
That's the way they write.
Well, and it's the economy stupid, as a famous American said, right? I think it still is the number one issue. It's only not in the headlines. And for Sarkozy, there's no interest to get back to the economic debate, because if he'd done this, actually he would have to talk about his bilan, his how do you say that? His
Bottom
results,
line, his achievements.
His accomplishments.
his accomplishments. And
No,
the accomplishments. You look at unemployment.
Yeah.
Plus 800,000 5 years, it's not working to his advantage. I have to read this quote. He was asked about this unemployment, and he said, well, in tendons, there's a shrinking increase of unemployment. That is not going very far.
Well, especially, it seems extraordinary. 3 weeks to go to the election, and Sarkozy is still saying that he's going to put out his manifesto maybe next week, and can everybody please stop asking him for it and be patient, and as if this is something that maybe he, hasn't had time to do, or...
Well, as if people would believe it anyway. I think that, I think actually Sarkozy has done about as much as could be done under the circumstances. And we've had this conversation before. I don't see exactly how Hollande plans to do anything. I was reading his program, all those 60 points in his program, and sort of turning it around and upside down and saying, how do you add this up?
And that was even before Mélenchon started pushing him to the left.
Yeah.
Because if he wants to win in the second round, if you add up the votes of the left in the second round, you do not get to 50%. So really, there's no way that Hollande is not going to have a sort of more radical way of campaigning to catch Mélenchon's voters, who are the more natural voters for him to get.
No, and I don't
It may not work out.
The right wing doesn't have a monopoly on cynicism in this country.
Absolutely.
And of course, the news cycle hasn't all been about jihadists in our midst this past week. There's also, the former boss of the IMF, placed last Monday under formal investigation for involvement in a prostitution ring. 2 days before the opening of his civil trial over an alleged sex attack on a hotel maid in New York, the press and here in France leaking testimony from prostitutes who claimed that Dominique Strauss-Kahn was the star attraction at orgies to lure clients to come to them in the north of France. You've written on this story, Anne-Elisabeth Moutet.
I write for the English press, of course. I have written about a French sex scandal.
This has stolen the limelight again from the campaign.
The campaign is vast; it contains multitudes. But it's interesting that the one thing that the Socialist Party must be sort of relieved about is the fact that this man is not the official candidate. If there hadn't been the incident in New York last summer, he would be the official candidate, a shoo-in, and suddenly he would have been asked to answer, or would he have been asked to answer about this ring of prostitutes in the same terms? Are we witnessing what happens to a member of the French elite when they lose their privileges? We'll never know. It's been very visible. He's been interrogated by judges. He's been formally charged. Would this have happened if he'd been the candidate? It's an interesting question.
You bet it would have come out. I think the Interior Ministry had all the dossiers piling up there and just waiting for him to become the candidate for the Socialists.
It's judges who decide to charge him or not. It's not the Interior
depends.
Ministry.
It depends. You leak enough stuff out on the marketplace, and you create a dynamic, so to say.
Look what happened to Jacques Chirac. I mean, it's not prostitutes, but, in terms of brown paper envelopes containing wads of money to pay for private trips, all of this went on until it was beyond the statute of limitations. We have a former president who's still sitting on the Constitutional Council, and eventually nothing will happen to him judicially, even though, believe me, there were corruption cases to be made that have sent bosses of large French companies in jail.
Welcome to
you
France.
can drag it on and on and on.
But
in
Anne
this
Elizabeth, you know
country.
perfectly well that the reason that corruption cases don't go further is because everybody is so damn corrupt in this country. I mean, if you look at the classic cases, all those cases that have come out, you even have situations where there were kickbacks that were being divided up among the parties. Yeah.
We're talking about party finance. Party finance is something that everybody in France, including the judges, see slightly differently. As long as there's not personal enrichment, the
but
French
who can
say,
tell if it's all cash and it's all
If
in
it's
brown
all cash,
paper
this is
envelopes,
very-
which is what it is.
And it's still, I mean,
Which is
this
exactly
is not the
what it is.
banana
also,
republic,
we're
is
also
it?
talking about, there was a watershed bill.
The
Actually, there were two watershed bills
problem
about
with DSK is
party
it's not
finance.
about that kind of corruption. It's about also
It's private.
phenomenal bad judgment. And I completely agree with Stefan. The files were sitting there waiting
Ready
to come
to
out.
go.
Whether they could have gotten an investigating magistrate to pump it up right at the right time, I'm not sure, but they could certainly have
they
leaked it to
would
the
have
press.
killed the
And
guy.
they were.
The press
they
knew.
were. The press did know.
The press
Well,
knew.
that
it
is
was-
a good question. I mean, for how long did the press know these details of what was going on in Lille and, around DSK without reporting it while he was head of the IMF?
Well, and not only in Lille. I mean, there are other cases
There are
lying
other
out there.
cases.
Yeah, well, there's
There's
Paris,
things-
there's Vienna, wherever he went.
Madrid.
And not
yeah.
only, I mean, there's even, there's just lots of stuff we probably shouldn't say right now.
One final question on this. In your article, you write that the French are better at having sex than talking about it.
What I'm saying that's the headline, but basically what I'm saying is that in France we do not know how to enjoy a real sex scandal. I mean, think of the defunct News of the World. Think of the way they treated the Max Mosley case, of the pixelated pictures of the orgies with little Formula One checkered flags
Where he was dressed as a
at
Nazi.
strategic places. The French are sort of immediately they're looking at this, and there's no. They are so embarrassed actually by the fact that it makes us look bad abroad, that they do not go into the actual detail. Strangely enough, the only paper that went into the detail is Le Monde, and it's not the first time. And I'm very surprised, but I think it may have to do with the fact that the chief editor is a woman.
All right. Well, when we come back in the world this week, we'll pick up on what could be a game changer across the Atlantic in the campaign. We're talking about that U.S. Supreme Court decision that'll be coming in June regarding healthcare, and also the Pope visits Fidel Castro. Stay with us.